This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I do want to join my other two from the panel and just say what a brilliant conference it's been and how much I've got out of it, and I've heard that reiterated the whole time through, so I'm sure we'll have brought you later, but I just wanted to say that. My study is on coins, so we're moving from textiles to metallic money, but we're still in the 18th century for this panel, but we're moving from elite to the poorer sorts, to the labouring poor, and the people who it's more difficult to actually access the emotions of. I'm going to tell you a little bit about one bit of my PhD, which I'm nearing the end of. And it's at the kind of intersection, if you like, between the study of material culture, the study of the poorer sorts, and the study of emotions historically. So I'm looking at, if you like, the history of emotion from below. So that's to kind of just position me. Okay. Unusually for me, I'm going to start with a quote. I usually start with loads of pictures of things because that's what I'm really into. But this is the quote that sort of starts my PhD. Except for their gravestones and their children, they left nothing identifiable behind them. For the marvellous surface of the British landscape, the work of their ploughs, spades and shears, and the beasts they looked after, bears no signature or mark such as the mason left on cathedrals. So this is a quote from the introduction to Hobsbawm and Riday's work on Captain Swing, which is a study of rural unrest in southern England in the beginning of the 19th century. And my kind of paper is saying, well, actually, I've got evidence that people did leave signatures from the 18th century, and that's what I want to focus on. And the evidence I'm looking at are love tokens crafted by those who worked for a living. Apprentices, sailors, servants, bricklayers, shoemakers, watermen, Thames watermen, dressmakers, those also who've lost their work, they're in prison, so prisoners, transports, people who've come up against the law in some way. Rather than imprints on the landscape or on buildings, these love tokens are records people produce to mark moments and events in their lives, and through them express their attachments to others. So it's that key thing, attachments to others, that I'm looking at. So although these things are called love tokens, I'm looking at very much as tokens of attachment. So these were made from low-value coins, these love tokens, from the resources people had to hand, and they were, in a way, freely created by the poorer sorts. Many of the studies of the poor at this time have used sort of institutional sources, if you like, to get at the emotions of the poor and kind of work around the edges of those, whereas these are things that freely were made by the poorer sorts. To create a token, the images of King George and of Britannia were rubbed away from the faces of copper coins at this time to create a blank disc. So there was a kind of blank canvas that people used, and it was on this that people then engraved images and idioms. So we'll have a kind of look through some of them as I go through. These ones are recording births, so they've got dates, they've got initials, they've sometimes got a name. I've just shown you individual coins there. Obviously each of those will have another face with another bit of information on them, so they're kind of always double-sided things. Not always every side's embellished, but most of them are. A variety of tools were used to craft them, depending on where they were made and the level of the skill of the maker. So the kind of tools that you see in the kind of advice books and kind of books at the time of the 18th century often had these kind of gravers that were often used in workshop conditions to embellish all the metallic objects that were, and guns and so forth, that were all being decorated with emblems and monograms and sort of ownership symbols, if you like. Some, however, were created from much simpler tools, what was available. For example, in prison, this could have been just a nail and a stone, and many of the later tokens that you might be familiar with of people transported to Australia have this dotty appearance, which indicates they only had access to something that would make a little kind of dent on the soft copper. The research I've been looking at here's a few more just to keep you interested. Some couples, so images of people and how they represented themselves. So the collection I've been looking at in particular detail are from the museum in Maidstone, and they're one of those classic sources where you go along and they're in a Tupperware box and that's it. And you kind of rummage through and kind of they've got a little bit of detail but not very much. And they're a collection that was left to the museum in 1951 by a very keen token collector called Reverend Ackworth. Reverend Ackworth was actually known particularly for his collection of hop tokens, which his reference work is still one of the ones used if anyone looks at hop tokens. But obviously today I'm going to look at his love token collection. So I want to discuss the crafting of tokens and start really by looking at how they came to be altered from a piece of money in the first place, and suggest that this money already, for some of them, had kind of emotional kind of meanings already, and money wasn't perhaps as anonymous as we might think about it today. So kind of shifting our thoughts about how we might view coins in our pockets. And I'm also going to kind of argue that this practice can be seen as part of a customary behaviour associated with expressing attachment to others. So tokens of affection illustrate the practice of creating an emotional object as a physical reminder of a person, a place, or event, and as a trigger for the sentiment associated with the practice and with the person. So my kind of thesis, if you like, is that they were in effect portable sites. So instead of kind of gravestones, which I will mention, they were very much portable sites that offered a place for people to go to and where they could think of others. So to start with the money side of things, social and economic historians have commented very generally on the poor condition of coinage, and particularly small change, during the 18th century. But actually very little detailed work has been carried out on the complex issues which led to the money in a labourer's pocket being made up of worn coins, commercial tokens, counterfeits, or even explored the effect that this kind of motley coinage had on people's attitudes to money. So these are, I'm just kind of spattering your kind of attention. These are ones which are about people's work that they've recorded. So why was money in such a bad state? There are a number of reasons relating to the production and distribution of copper coins, but also to the increasing demand for coins of low value to pay those employed in manufacturing businesses. The Royal Mint was contracted by the Treasury to manufacture gold and silver coins, but producing copper coins was not part of their remit. They kind of did it out of a sort of condescension. Well, we better have a bit of low value coins for the poor, so here we go. So as a result, the production of regal copper coins was very erratic through the 18th century. In fact, hardly any were minted between 1754 and 1797, which is when Matthew Bolton's Soho Mint took the contract to produce them. So that was one factor which meant there wasn't a lot of copper circulating. The other one was that the Royal Mint's budget for producing coins did not include the cost of distributing them. So they produced them in London, they were minted there, you could go there and buy packets of coins, 5 or 10 shillings worth. But then how they were then distributed around the country, the Mint wasn't worried. It was very much dependent on private enterprise. So it was a very kind of London-centric behaviour around copper coins. This is in kind of contrast to the fact that demand for copper coins was increasing in manufacturers around the country who wanted to pay more and more labourers in this kind of value coin. So where coins were not produced in sufficient quantities or did not reach the provinces, because there were no distribution networks, there were kind of reactions in terms of, demand was increasing, and this was met by then local counterfeiters taking up the kind of slack, if you like. So, okay, there's no money, we'll kind of just forge it. Okay. So the shortage was aggravated, therefore, by a lack of convertibility. So the other problem was that if you were like the pub and everybody was paying you in coppers, you couldn't convert the coppers because the Mint, the Excise and Revenue, the Bank of England and country banks could refuse to accept copper coins over the value of sixpence as payment of a bill or to be converted into silver or gold or paper currency. So the kind of things got stagnated and restricted by this lack of circulation. So as I say, there were kind of two main ways that people dealt with these problems. One was counterfeiting. This was achieved by melting down coins and turning them into lightweight blanks, which were then stamped to look like worn coins. Thomas Snelling, who wrote in 1766, and I quote, "In the beginning of the year 1753, it was computed that near half or 2/3 of the current copper money was counterfeit," close quote. One of the problems with the forgery laws at the time was that you could be, it was a capital offence to forge gold and silver, but not copper. So we're again thinking of copper as quite a kind of, low-level status thing. It was only after 1771 that it became a capital offence to counterfeit coppers. So the second response to this lack of copper currency was that people made their own tokens. So there was a revival of kind of industrial or mercantile tokens.
And you might be familiar with these kinds of ones, yes.
Yeah. So from the late 1780s, manufacturers and some towns produced their own commercial tokens. They were difficult to forge and so became popular among labourers, publicans, retailers. And they, in a way, provided something that the Mint wasn't providing. And ironically, the Mint had to acknowledge them as legal tender until the beginning of the 19th century in 1817, when there was another recoinage. So it's about kind of people made do and even were creative with the situation, if you like. So what did this mean in terms of people's attitudes to money? People would have a mixture of coins. They would have good coins, as in kind of regal ones. They would have bad coins, as in counterfeits. They would have worn ones, old ones, token coins. You would have foreign coins in circulation, marked coins, hold coins, and clipped coins. All these versions were in circulation. It just highlights the manner in which people adapted the monetary system to their needs, especially where it was wanting. It's reflected also in the language that people used to refer to money. Money was known by names such as the bustle, the necessary, the needful, the iron, the Spanish, and, depending on how it was used, in counterfeiting, it almost adopted human qualities. Coins were sweated, they were clipped, they were washed, they were rounded, even tonsured. Ones that were genuine were talked about as plump, so they weren't the warm, thin counterfeits, they were the plump, real coins. So, having thought about, why this had come about, my analysis of blood tokens has shown that, they reflect people's emotional needs as well as financial ones. And having a look at some of the coins that survived from the 18th century does call into question the physical anonymity of money at this time. And I used the theories of Viviana Zelizer, who did some study of kind of how money was earmarked. So the idea of multiple monies, that people have money for different purposes, and kind of applied that to the physical marking of money in the 18th century. And I looked at the Old Bailey records and found accounts such as people saying, being questioned, saying things like, "Did you mark your money?" Was the question of a witness at the trial of Peter Daly in 1748. In 1775, James Pearce was asked, "Have you any particular mark to it?" meaning a piece of a coin. And the reply was, "There is a black spot on the smooth side of it by which I know it." So marking coins in some way and identifying money by individual scratches, spots and marks is referred to in a number of Old Bailey trials. In some examples, money was marked as a preventative measure in order to detect and prove theft. In addition, people also kept coins as what was called pocket pieces, often for lengthy periods of time, as demonstrated in this statement from a trial in 1780. So here's the quote from a witness. "Here is a Flemish halfpenny amongst them, which has a mark upon the edge by which I know it." Talking about two other pieces of coins, "Two of the doits have holes through them. I have had them years and know them well." So the notion of knowing individual coins well provides evidence of the length of time some coins were kept, and almost the status of kind of non-financial kind of meaning they had acquired. They became almost objects of attachment. So metallic money not only facilitated daily needs for some, but was also used to negotiate many different spheres. For example, to establish relationships in prison, you needed to pay your way. To formalise an annual contract at a hiring fair, there was usually an exchange of a coin. If you were a gambler, they were often a counter. Obviously, we've heard about protective environments where coins might be brought in. They were definitely used against illness, evil spirits, bad luck, carried on the body as a talismanic object. And we've heard also about them being used in rituals such as weddings and betrothals. So what I'm trying to establish is that love tokens made from coins can be seen as part of a customary behaviour that commemorated family attachment and solidarity, and that they can be placed alongside other similar inscribed objects and surfaces. Sarah Tarlow's work on gravestones focuses on the second half of the 18th century, and it identifies a significant shift in the custom of carving headstones and marking burial sites among the lower ranks. Recording names, dates, idioms and images on headstones developed as part of the process of commemorating the dead by visiting them in the churchyard. Before the 18th century, according to Sarah Tarlow, it was predominantly the elite who were erecting monuments and commemorating the dead. Among the poorer sorts, there were often more temporary markers, whereas by the end of the 18th century, she's identifying a shift to carved headstones among the kind of lower ranks. She comments on some of the characteristics of the headstones, remarking that the letters were poorly formed, inconsistent and sometimes in reverse. And this is something I've found also on love tokens. She makes the case that this boom in marking graves stemmed from the motivation to mark where someone was buried in order to visit the grave as part of the process of sustaining the bond between the living and the dead. And she relates this to a growing awareness of sentiment in the late 18th century, a kind of case for heightened sensibility as a focus of attention moves to the living rather than the dead, on the emotional distress of the parents and the children of the living. But I would say my study of love tokens also offers evidence of the desire to have a physical and portable reminder of their existence, of people's existence, and to create emotional objects that provided an intimate site for grief rather than the kind of public gravestone. Love tokens made from coins were exchanged from the early 18th century and performed a similar role in acting as a memory trigger for the absent and the deceased. In addition to coins, objects such as utensils and tools were also sites of alteration and marking with names and dates, recording events such as births, weddings and death. So we've seen a few of these images already, I think, in the conference with knitting sheaths and so forth. But the kind of whole graffiti idea, I suppose, in trying to put the love tokens into a broader sense of written on objects, if you like. And obviously some of these also, we've heard, go back into the 17th century. There was obviously a pattern that I'm trying to sort of slot into. And you can also see it in the evidence of textual sources. So the words of ballads and penny merriments demonstrate the behaviour associated with the exchange of emotional objects, such as coins and tokens. Broken token ballads you might be familiar with, such as The Dark-Eyed Sailor, songs familiar to an 18th century audience accustomed to listening to travelling pedlars and ballad singers. With phrases such as, "A ring of gold he took off my hand, he broke the token, a half to keep, half he bade me treasure." So the theme of the breaking of a token as lovers parted, and the token as an object of recognition when reunited, were well established in the ballad and broadside literature of the period. In addition, words such as those in the ballad called The Token describe love tokens given between Sailor Jack and his sweetheart Nancy, but they include a broken coin but also a lock of hair. We've heard a lot about hair, and an inscription on a tobacco box that says, "If you loves I as I love you, no pair so happy as us two." So in this way, the sailor and the sweetheart exchanged objects they could look at while they were separated. In the same way as gravestones offered a place for people to visit, I would suggest that tokens were used as a portable site where people could go to think of others. So I've picked out some ones that are more about memorials, and actually I've had to go further afield than the Ackworth collection to look at some of these. They offered a focus, an object to gaze on, where people could remember the absent and the dead. These objects became layered with sentiment. Exchanged as part of commemorative practices, tokens were infused with the feelings associated with the customs they facilitated. In other words, used in courtship and marriage, the attendant feelings of affection, love and attachment to lovers became embedded in them. Similarly, tokens associated with separation and with death were charged with feelings of loss, grief and remembrance, as well as the feelings such exchanges imparted, such as love and sorrow. Tokens also acquired the sentiments the personal inscriptions engraved on them instilled. In other words, the crafting and exchanging of tokens created objects layered in emotions. So to sum up, through the paper I've introduced a group of objects freely created by the poor, and as such I kind of make the claim they are important historical sources, although fragments of sources. I've begun to outline how the practice of altering money can be linked to practices of earmarking money for different purposes, including effective ones. The process of engraving and exchanging them, I suggest, invested them with sentiments associated with the customary practices they facilitated and performed, and to this was added the personal affections that the inscriptions and the circumstances of their giving implanted. In addition, and it's something I probably should have stressed at the beginning, is the scale of these things. They're enormous there, aren't they? But they're tiny. They're kind of, I think 28, 26 millimetres, that kind of thing. So we're talking about very small objects intended for intimate perusal, made to be touched, worn around the neck if they've got a hole in them, looked at. And unlike the gravestones that provided a physical marker for the living to visit the dead, engraved coins offered a portable reminder and a material expression of those still living, of those who were absent, as well as those no longer alive. These were emotional objects, and remembering the opening quote that I gave to this paper, they were also traces of the poorer sorts that they left behind to record their existence and their sentiments.